I'm super excited to introduce you to Jacob tonight. I first learned about him by reading an interview, and it caught my attention because the ideas that he was talking about, I think, applied widely to what people are doing on campus right now, such as new and digital media, media history, art and technology, queer theory, and media archaeology. So Jacob is an assistant professor of digital media and visual culture at Stony Brook University and a staff writer for the art and technology organization Rhizome at the New Museum for Contemporary Art. His work engages the early history of computer graphics and visualization, as well as queer theories and histories of technology. He currently holds a research fellowship at the University of Minnesota's Charles Babbage Institute and is co-director of the Queer Art and Technology Research Group at the I-Beam Art and Technology Center in New York City. Also, we're doing a group critique with him tomorrow in the photo hangar bays from 10 until noon. The spots to actually be critted are taken, but we would invite you guys to come if you just want to participate in the conversation. So anyways, Jacob.
Thank you, Troy, for that introduction and for inviting me to come and present today. And thank you as well to the Academy, to Cranbrook, for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this project with you all today and sort of get your ideas and feedback as well, and talk to you tomorrow about your work and how it might intersect with these sort of large swath of research interests that I have, and hopefully I can offer some useful suggestions. So today I want to begin with a provocation of sorts, or maybe an argument. I want to argue for the critical importance of queer art and criticism that engages digital media technology. Not simply because that's the topic that I came to talk to you about today, and not because it's a topic that's of particular interest to me personally, but I think it's a topic of critical importance to the world that we live in, and that queer work is uniquely positioned to engage in questions of contemporary digital media technology. So I want to begin with this sort of argument, and I'm going to present it, more as a kind of a talk, like a paper of sorts. And I'll start that way, reading, but then I want to move into a discussion of a set of collaborators that I've worked with the past several years, artists whose work engages these questions of identity, sexuality, queer theory, and technology, and use that as a way of talking about a kind of larger research practice. And then I want to end by talking about my own research project, which is sort of the title of this talk, on Uncomputable Numbers, A Queer History of Computing. So it's sort of a three-part talk, if you will. But I want to begin again by making sort of a claim, or asking a question, sort of, why queer computing? The growth of digital media technologies has had a transformative effect on the way that we construct identity and build community. This is particularly true for queer and marginalized groups for whom network technologies in particular have facilitated new forms of contact and connection. Queer people use technology in any number of transgressive ways, be it for sex, for politics, for art, and for scholarship. We queer technology by finding new and novel uses for it, and by transforming it to conform to our needs and desires. But at the same time, digital media has come to affect identity itself. As the complexity of cultural and social difference becomes categorizable by Google AdWords, a series of drop-down menus and boxes to check. Indeed, I think we could argue that digital media facilitates the construction of identity precisely because identity categories are so legible to the true-false 0-1 binary logic of digital systems. This is nowhere more apparent than in a recent pair of changes made to the way that Facebook understands and categorizes gender identity. And if you'll allow me, I want to kind of diverge into an anecdote for a second in order to illustrate this broader point that I'd like to make. So as some of you may remember, in February of this year, Facebook added the ability to select a custom gender for user profiles in the United States. It was recently expanded into the UK as well. This allows individuals to choose from a list of 51 gender identities that include things like genderqueer, intersex, cis, and two-spirit, among, as I said, 51 total. Users could also choose the pronoun they preferred the service to use in its friendly greetings and reminders to them. So it's Jacob's birthday today, wish her a happy birthday, for example. For many, the move was hailed as progressive and as a step forward. Finally, Facebook is allowing for a true range of gender expression to be made visible through its services. No longer will we be limited to these socially constructed gender binaries. And yet, despite this shift from 2 to 51, despite the apparent explosion of the gender binary into a kind of gender multiplicity, the logic behind Facebook's move remains deeply tied to a kind of binary structure, or at the very least, a kind of digital one. And here I mean digital not only in the sense of digital media, but in the sense of separate and discrete. Digital in the way that my fingers are digits, or in the way that whole numbers exclude the many infinities of values between 0 and 1, or 1 and 2. All of this is to say that when Facebook gives you more gender options with which to identify, they're still engaging in an act of identification. They've simply broken up the ways in which they seek to identify you and make you legible to targeted advertising based on a set of metrics that include gender and sexuality. If anything, the user is now conscripted into enacting the labor of identification once reserved for sophisticated algorithms. Now, this relationship between identity and identification is made all the more clear if we contrast this original inclusive gesture, this explosion of gender, with a more recent Facebook controversy surrounding the so-called real names policy. For those who aren't familiar with this, earlier this month, Facebook began to shut down the personal profiles of a number of drag queens and trans people, claiming that it appeared these profiles were using aliases that were in violation of Facebook's real names policy. Users were asked to produce documentation of the validity of their names in order to have their accounts reinstated. And this caused an uproar that reached across the LGBT community, and activists and community leaders in California actually went to the Facebook offices in order to try and resolve the block and have everyone's accounts reinstated. Facebook claimed this was sort of a standard policy for policing false profiles that were intended to bully or harass or hack other accounts. But of course, drag queens who use Facebook as a means of advertising appearances and promoting shows saw this as an attack on their livelihood, and trans people saw it as an affront to their very identity, an attempt to erase them from the network. One of the most interesting things about this example is actually the way that it brought together parts of the GLBT community that, while certainly part of what we might call a community, don't necessarily always sort of speak together with one voice. In particular, one of the most vocal participants in this was Sister Roma, whose Facebook profile you can see here and who's in the sort of center left of this image, who's a member of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, which is a sort of drag group, to just briefly describe it maybe, in San Francisco and in Seattle and on the West Coast largely. But the way that these communities worked together with trans communities who, not but a few months prior, many people had been in sort of a bit of a controversial conversation about the use of particular words and expressions to identify members of the trans community and members of the drag community. And so to see these people kind of come together around this issue, I think, speaks to its broad relevance across issues for queer people more generally. Now, after a month of this sort of impasse, after the entire month of September, these debates happening, Facebook refusing, it appears the issue's been resolved. And actually, last night, Facebook issued a public apology with promises to fix the issue and allow users to use whatever name it is that they use in their daily lives, legal or not. But the question remains as to why there was such a discrepancy between, on the one hand, a gesture of inclusivity, and on the other, a gesture of exclusion and refusal. Literal exclusion from the network. Ultimately, I think what's at stake here is indicative of the form and function of identity in our contemporary digital society. Facebook doesn't care who you are or how you identify. It only cares that you have an identity that is addressable to Facebook, or more specifically, an identity that's addressable by Facebook's ad network. It's morally indifferent to and willing to accommodate the particularity of your unique identity or user profile, but in order for that profile to be useful, it must be legible and ideally an accurate representation of your inner self. Now, I don't want to overstate the case here, and this is clearly not the historical and artistic material that I originally came here to discuss. And certainly I think we could dismiss this as kind of like a PR mishap or as an unfortunate but understandable marketing decision given that Facebook's business is ad-supported. But I don't think it's quite that simple. And in fact, I'd like to argue that this case is exemplary of a sort of broader structuring paradigm in the way that computational media have come to shape our contemporary society. In particular, the way that these technologies have come to shape how we conceive of and perform our identities, which is a subject of great significance to queer theory and I think to queer people in general. In her 2004 book, Network Culture, the scholar Tiziana Terranova talks about the way that in information theory, communication's concerned with the question of signal and noise. And that information flow has come to displace the question of representation and cultural identity from the center of cultural struggles. So informatic machines don't care about what you say, only that it's legible as a signal and that it can be sent through the network. In other words, those sites that have most concerned queer theory for the past 30 years, things like identity, interiority, performance, representation, affect, all are at best vacated by new media technologies and at worst reappropriated in the implementation of new forms of control, which Alexander Galloway has sort of described as protocol, this sort of control that networks enact on us. Under the schema, society no longer functions in a kind of disciplinary mode wherein we're sort of normalized through institutional power, where you send people to like a mental health institution because they're gay. It doesn't work that way anymore. Instead, we sort of cultivate difference and make it legible and categorizable so that it can be made useful in the service of power. Under the schema, we're all equally legible in our difference, and we're sort of compelled to identify through race, gender, sexuality, age, taste, preference, etc. Certainly, we're all complex individuals. We exist beyond these categories. We're not all, we can't sort of boil us all down into our Google profile. But the point is that technology exists indifferent to those particularities. All it cares about is whether or not we are addressable. The self is essentially black boxed, reduced to a limited set of input and output signals. So what I'm suggesting here is that difference no longer serves as a functional site of resistance to power or critique, because difference in terms of identity has been incorporated into the broader logic of society. So we can no longer produce art and criticism that deals with issues of identity that continue to ignore the fact that identity has been radically transformed in this way. And we can no longer produce queer work that does not engage with the deeply rooted technical conditions that shape modern identity as a way of being and engaging in the world. So shortly, and this is sort of the end of my sort of theory rant maybe, is to say simply that it's time for queer theory and queer art to engage in a critique of digital media technologies. One that does more than simply queer technology. So to this end, I've been working for the past 4 years, approximately, with a group of artists, archivists, historians, and activists on building a kind of queer coalition that engages with contemporary technology. And given the context of today's talk and where we are right now, I thought I would share and discuss some of the work of these artists as a way of identifying the kinds of practices that I'm interested in sort of seeing and discussing and promoting. The projects that we've produced largely take place as public talks and workshops. We're also currently producing an edited collection, and many of these artists work on interactive performances that I've participated in as well. So the work really ranges across a variety of artistic and technical disciplines. The first artist I want to discuss is Misha Cardenas, whose work kind of operates at the intersection of transgender studies and performance, as well as sort of art and technology more broadly. The piece that you see here is from 2008. It's called Becoming Dragon. I point out that it's from 2008 in part because, as you can see, it's a piece that takes place in Second Life. And I feel like the problem with new media technologies is it's very easy to create a work that feels dated very shortly after it's produced. and I don't know if anyone is still making work in Second Life necessarily, but it was a very sort of radical site for art at the time. So Misha's work is a critique in the form of a kind of endurance performance, wherein she spent 365 hours hooked up to a VR headset and other VR prosthetics, embodying the character, her Second Life character, in the form of a dragon for the totality of that time without pause. And it was meant as a critique of the requirement that trans people spend 365 days living as the gender to which they wish to transition, undergoing psychological treatment, or not treatment rather, but counseling, before they're allowed legally to transition from one gender to another. And for many people, this requirement is seen as obviously onerous, but also as a kind of barrier and a kind of bureaucratic sort of stepping stone of sorts that is put in the way of a lot of people's sort of both health and emotional needs and desires. And so to critique this as a kind of endurance and as a kind of performance, she sort of embodied this character and embodied the kind of performative role of not only a different gender, but also a different species within the game of Second Life for 365 hours, which is not an insubstantial period of time to be inside of a game. And it took place in a public space. People could come and participate and observe as it sort of happened. More recently, Misha's work has moved into wearable technology and microelectronics. So this is a piece produced from 2012 to the present called AutoNets, which is both a kind of workshop series and a sort of autonomous network practice. So the piece takes place within a particular set of communities wherein Misha holds workshops to ask people who live and exist within precarious contexts, so largely trans people in particular communities, sex workers in particular communities, about what safety looks like to them and feels like to them, and is sort of questioning the idea of feeling safe within your body within a particular context. And then it sort of developed, she has developed a set of dances, sort of movements, performances based on the feedback from those workshops. And then they are performed within a particular space and context. In the upper left-hand corner, you'll see, I think that's from Sao Paulo. And on the bottom left, I believe that's in San Diego. So the sort of the first step is the production of a kind of social network, an embodied social network of people who exist in a condition of precarity, and a network that comes out of the community itself and isn't imposed from outside. And the idea is that sort of through these performances, but also through a kind of agreement, people will sort of support and come to the aid of those who may be under threat. And then to supplement this, she's begun to produce a series of wearable electronics. You see people are wearing them on both the bottom left and on the right. Sort of this hoodie kind of wrap thing, which I think is still in a rather preliminary stage at this point, but the idea behind them is that they'll create a kind of electronic network, a kind of network to support this social network, wherein people who are in danger can use these tools to call upon others who are also networked within a kind of local network to come assist them if necessary. Misha's also worked quite a bit. She's in Southern California with sort of issues of immigration and migrant labor and border crossing. So her work tries to sort of intersect questions of performance and endurance with questions of precarity and sort of who's included. But I think also importantly, she's interested in not sort of imposing technology on groups for whom that technology might not be useful or necessary. And these things come out of kind of an interactive workshop between individuals, which I think is really crucial and something that is often a critique of these kinds of new media and technology projects. The second artist that I've worked really closely with is Zach Blass. Zach is currently an assistant professor at the University of Buffalo. And he has been working since about 2009, initially on a series of projects called Queer Technologies, which you see two pieces of here. Queer Technologies is sort of also a kind of provocation, but it was meant to be more in the form of kind of black bloc tactics, and a kind of more of a kind of sort of a radical invisibility tactics. So the idea behind it was to produce a series of technologies that could be dropped within stores and that would appear to be purchasable technologies that then critique the kind of technology you would find there. So on the right you see Transcoder, which was a queer programming anti-language that he developed to kind of critique the gendered assumptions that go into the way that we describe and understand programming languages, things like and/or statements and that sort of thing. And as you can see, there's sort of a graphic design element to all these projects where they were made to look and exist alongside other purchasable technologies. On the left, you'll see a piece called Engendering Gender Changers, which critiques the way in which input-output cables and ports are described in terms of gender. So if you ever buy a port or a plug, it'll say like male to female or male to male or female to female. And so he sort of, in much in the same way, I suppose, that the Facebook example explodes difference to, and he sort of hacked these things by putting them together in strange combinations and finding, so there's, I think, I'm not sure which ones these are. There's sort of a like cis male to trans female, like those kinds of devices. And as you can imagine, these are not meant to be practical. They're not like anyone's going to plug this into a computer necessarily, although maybe they would if they purchased it or tried to purchase it. Often they were also left in art spaces and people could take them, I think, without paying for them as well. So this is sort of the initial practice. There's a whole series of technologies that he produced. These are just two of them. But since 2011, Zach's been working on a series of masks and other sort of face-related technologies, which he calls the facial weaponization suite. So the suite consists of 5 masks that are built using the biometric data of workshop participants as a way of critiquing surveillance and sort of obligatory visibility within contemporary network society. So this is the first mask he produced, which is called Fag Face. And it's based on a series of studies that were done wherein people found that supposedly individuals are capable of judging the sexuality of an individual based on a very brief exposure to their face. So you can just see someone's face and make assumptions about their sexuality, and that it's surprisingly accurate. So sort of thinking through the way that biometrics are transforming the way that we see and understand sexual identity. Zach produces workshops wherein people sort of come together, do readings, do sort of discussion, and then individuals volunteer to have their faces scanned, and the biometric data is then compiled into a mask that's sort of seen as the object that is produced by the workshop. It sort of evolved over time. Initially, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, he started by taking the information from people's faces and doing an additive process. The way that biometrics usually work is they average out difference between faces so that you can get a sense of what like a human face looks like. That's how Facebook knows when you have a face in a photo, is because it has a sense of what the average face appears to be. And so rather than do this averaging, he did an additive process. So it sort of turns into this strangely almost sort of baboon-like face wherein features are expanded and made strange or grotesque. Ultimately, the technique that he settled on is much more abstract, as you can see here. And this is the first mask, which, as I said, is meant to be sort of about sexuality, and so it's this pink mask. There were several others, though. This is a workshop that he conducted at I-Beam last year. That's me on the left, wearing a mask. And sort of these were produced in different sites. There was one that was produced in Mexico City, one that was produced in San Diego with different kinds of communities. And this has sort of evolved now. Well, there are 5 masks. I should say this mask is the blue mask, and the blue mask has to do with the questions of and politics of the veil and veiling, and sort of particularly in the context of Europe and the idea And in France, as you may recall, there's sort of controversy around the refusing women, or not letting women wear the veil in particular contexts. And it's sort of a critique of the assumption that sort of visibility and the visibility of the face is a kind of neutral condition that all people should necessarily allow, and trying to think about the way that refusing the visibility of the face can be a kind of empowering gesture. Rather than seeing these women as victims, we can imagine them as empowering themselves by refusing visibility. There's also a mask you'll see a bit later that's about sort of critical practices of blackness and critical race theory and these kinds of things. So like I said, there are 5 masks. This project has transformed more recently into a series called Face Cages, which he just started, I think, last year. Yeah, last year. And these use biometric data as well to create sort of applying this metaphor that is often used to describe the appearance of biometric visualization, to actually apply it directly to the face, to talk about the way that biometrics enact a kind of violence on particular individuals. And this project is particularly interested in the way that biometrics not only allow us to be visible, but also leave out certain kinds of groups and can't account for certain kinds of bodies. So for example, Asian women's fingertips are difficult to read using fingerprint identification methods at things like border crossings. I'm sure you've all seen examples on like Facebook or something like that, articles about how certain skin tones, and particularly darker skin tones, aren't legible often to cameras that automatically recognize and track faces. Similarly, those cameras often think that Asian eyes are blinking when they're not and ask you to retake a photo because it appears the person blinked in the photo. And I think most crucially, for Zach at least, is the way that biometrics, by averaging out difference between bodies, leaves out certain kinds of bodies, particularly non-normative bodies. So people with disabilities in particular are often rendered invisible by biometrics. So it's sort of interesting thinking about the 2 projects in contrast to one another. On the one hand, we want to be able to refuse visibility through tactics like masking, but on the other hand, these techniques can enact a kind of erasure that can be violent in its own right. So these are the kinds of questions that Zach is sort of working with. Visibility, biometrics, the face, etc. So the work of these artists is really fantastic, and it's inspired a lot of my own critical writing and academic practice. What the work gives us, I think, and what makes it visible is a set of sort of practices or tactics, as I described, with which we can create and critique these kinds of technical systems. So what do these tactics look like, I think, then is the question, and how do we apply them as a kind of critical practice? So if we imagine communication to be structured by technical systems, which is sort of what I've been arguing so far, then implicit in such a critique, there's an alternative to connection, transmission, and identification in things like their negation in signal failure, noise, and illegibility. So it's here, I think, that we can identify something like a queer kind of computation outside of these imperatives that we always successfully communicate with one another, in forms of computation that fail or break down or recur or run forever. So in sort of a politics of illegibility, a politics of refusal, a politics of failure. There are several artists that sort of are thinking and working at this intersection as well. And I'm sure many of you seen, we don't have to listen to the audio necessarily. This is Jillian Mayer's piece, How to Hide from Cameras, which is from last year. And it's a makeup tutorial, which is a very common genre on YouTube. I'm sure you've seen them before, for things like smoky eyes and stuff like that. But here she's sort of doing a makeup, and it's done in a sort of parody, right? It's meant to sort of mirror, as you can see, the language and aesthetic of that particular kind of video. So she is basically creating a mask of sorts using makeup that makes a face difficult to recognize by facial recognition techniques. So for example, the face is assumed to be symmetrical, so by creating certain kinds of breaks in the face, it disrupts that symmetry and makes it difficult for you to see. Geometric shapes that have harsh angles don't seem human and so often are unrecognizable as well. And it's sort of it's a long video that we don't, I'm not meaning to show the whole thing, but it's actually, it's actually kind of a funny video, and I think she's intending for it to be that kind of a piece, and it actually circulated rather widely, I think, in part for that reason. She's by no means the only person that's done this kind of work. This is Adam Harvey's piece, CV Dazzle, that also was from 2003, but received a lot of press in 2014 this year. And there was a whole piece on Dis Magazine about it that he wrote up and talked about not only his own work, but kind of this broader political tactic. And again, it's sort of an attempt to say, what are the ways in which computers understand the face to function, and can we go through a kind of iterative process where we try and break that by experimenting with what happens if I put makeup here, what happens if when am I no longer recognizable as a face, basically. So I think it's a sort of interesting way of using a particular art practice to kind of hack at these particular algorithms in an interesting way. And I think it's especially interesting that it uses technologies, I think we could describe them, that are sort of femme technologies as well, things like makeup, styling, hair, etc., as a kind of weapon in the way that Zach describes it, and I find that particularly compelling. Another sort of practice we could think about is something like glitch and glitch aesthetics. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Rhizome, who you see here. Rosa's at, I believe, the University of Amsterdam. This is a piece called The Vernacular of File Formats, where she takes a picture of herself in, I think, 5 different file formats, so like TIFF, PNG, JPEG, GIF, etc., or GIF, if you will. And then there's an essay that accompanies the piece where she describes the different methods for digitization and compression, and then in understanding how it works, she then is able to explain how to break it, and in order to break it, she produces a particular visual style. So each of the pieces is glitched in a particular way, and by glitching it, it makes visible the way in which it compresses things, for example. So the sort of horizontal bands of this particular image tell us something about the way that the file format produces an image. So it's a kind of, again, a practice that looks to break technology as a way of critiquing technology. So in thinking through these critical practices of refusal and resistance, we're drawing on over 20 years of queer work that engages, or I'm drawing on over 20 years of queer work that engages in these questions of negativity and failure. Particularly interesting for me is the work of Jack Halberstam and people like Lee Edelman, who've tried to shift the dialogue in queer politics away from these stories of pride and redemption and inclusivity, and sort of reframing queer existence and thinking about negativity, shame, and failure as states of being that might be, for lack of a better term, useful to a queer politics. So rather than think of failure as a sort of temporary state on the way to success, we can think about failure as a form of life that critiques the assumption that we should succeed, or that success is always and necessarily the best goal. And when I say failure, I mean failure in a variety of ways. Failure especially to achieve certain kinds of goals. Failure to maybe have a family or children or reproduce. It's a critique of compulsory reproduction and compulsory production under capitalism, for example. So we can apply this very easily to technology, too. I mean, technology has the same kind of productivity narrative that we see in our everyday lives. We assume that technology will fix all of our problems if we just keep developing it. We assume that new technology is always better technology. And we ignore things like planned obsolescence, or when our machines don't work, buggy machines, confusing applications, these kinds of things. We pretend like that doesn't exist, and we assume that technology will always get better. And new technology is always a good thing. I'm just finished a piece for art papers on something what I'm calling vernacular computing, which is basically about there was a piece just recently on BuzzFeed about grandparents who sign Facebook messages as Grandmaster Flash because they put in grand and it auto-completes as Grandmaster Flash. And like the way that people, that we just sort of ignore or refuse to see how technology doesn't always work, or the way that it doesn't work for certain people, or the way that its sort of failures are very visible in these tiny, interesting ways. These sort of vernacular uses of computing, I think, are super interesting. So this is the context in which my own work takes place. And I'd like to turn sort of now to a discussion of my own historical research, which seeks to produce a queer theory of computation through a critical history of computer science and a critical analysis of a set of technical practices that I think are best understood through the lens of queer theory and queer critique. So I'm thinking not only of how we can use technology in queer ways, which a lot of these artists are doing, and I think is fantastic, but also the ways that we should and can understand technology to be sort of from the very beginning a kind of queer thing. So the first part of this project is the one I've developed most thoroughly, and it's already taken the form of a series of 5 essays that I published on Rhizome in 2013. And it's a history that follows the life and work of 5 figures in the early history of computer science, sort of from the formation of the concept of computing in 1936 until the rise of the Gay Liberation Front in the 1970s. So it begins, maybe unsurprisingly, with the life and work of Alan Turing, who's a British mathematician widely regarded as the father of computer science. Some of you may know Turing or have heard of him. The centenary of his birth was 2 years ago, and there were a ton of events to sort of commemorate it. Maybe more visibly, there's a film starring Benedict Cumberbatch that's coming out, I think, this year, in a month. Maybe it already came out. It's coming out very soon, called The Imitation Game. That's sort of about the work he did in the 1940s during the Second World War. But during his relatively brief career, Turing basically formalized concepts like an algorithm. What is an algorithm? What is computation? He helped crack the Nazi Enigma code, which saved really thousands, if not millions of lives during the Second World War. He was a pioneer in the field of artificial intelligence. He developed early concepts like neural nets. And he was also an openly gay man in a really early moment, who in January of 1952 was actually convicted of gross indecency by the British government and made to undergo chemical castration, and ultimately he committed suicide in 1954. So he's been the subject of a lot of work, and he's in a lot of ways the most recognizable figure in the history of computer science, and he's certainly the most recognizable queer figure in this history. And so it's really necessary, understandably, to begin with Turing as a figure, not only because of the visibility of his difference, but for the fundamental role he played in defining what computation is and therefore what the limits of computation could be. And in defining those limits, I think he also sort of defines a queer outside to computation. So the way that most people, there's very little work about Turing as a queer figure, but one of the few ways that his work is sometimes described in terms of gender and sexuality is with what's called the Turing test. Some of you may have heard of this. There was a weird bogus story this year about like a Russian AI computer that was like a 7-year-old boy doing the Turing test, which was people don't necessarily take the Turing test seriously as a measure of actual artificial intelligence, but it's traditionally used as a kind of simple test to tell whether or not something can be considered intelligent in the way that we consider one another in a rudimentary sense intelligent. For those who aren't familiar, it's very simple. Basically, a user is asked to ask questions to sort of invisible, unseen other, who could be either a person or a computer. And after a series of questions, they're made to guess if it is a person or a computer, and if a certain amount of time they guess incorrectly that it is a person when in fact it is a computer, then the computer is demonstrating what we can describe as a kind of intelligence, which is again why it's called sometimes the imitation game, again the title of the film coming out soon. That's interesting by itself, but what's particularly interesting is that there's a second part of the Turing test that's often noted, wherein you don't guess whether it's a machine or a person, but you guess the gender of the person that you're speaking to. And Turing doesn't see this as a separate test, he sees it as part of the same test, and not a test of intelligence necessarily, but as a kind of check for the way that the test functions. So this idea of performativity and passing are really critical topics for queer theory and queer studies, and so understandably people gravitate toward this work as a way of thinking about queerness and intelligence and computing. And it is, I think, a very compelling place to begin. But what interests me more than this is Turing's earlier work, which is about the origins of the theory of computation itself. So This is, very briefly the way that Turing describes what computation is in a paper called Uncomputable Numbers, which you'll notice is where the title of my presentation comes from, in 1936. And basically, computation is any system that can execute a set of instructions described procedurally. So if I tell a computer what to do and it can sort of follow those instructions and give me an answer, it's sort of performing an act of computation. And the important thing about computation is that a computer can only do what you tell it to do, which is the challenge of computation and why it takes so long to do things like program a piece of software, because you have to describe in advance everything that it needs to do in order for it to be able to perform that computation. So what's interesting about this piece is that Turing not only describes what computation is, but he therefore describes what computation isn't, or what is excluded from this definition of computation. These are acts that he describes as creative or intuitive in nature, things that sort of escape procedural description, things that we can't understand through a kind of mathematics and logic. The most famous of these is something called the halting problem, which I'm just going to describe really quickly because this is probably more computer science than anyone ever wanted to know. But the halting problem is basically a program that you could write that says, does this program stop or does it run forever? You sort of feed the program in and it spits out an answer. It runs forever or stops. It's pretty straightforward, right? So this is a program that could exist very easily. We don't need to bother with how it works. But you could also then take that program and put it back into itself and say, does this program stop or run forever? Which produces a paradox, because if it says, oh, it stops, that means that it's saying the answer is that it runs forever. And if it says that it runs forever, that means that it stopped. Basically, it's a mathematical paradox, similar to the sort of famous paradox of the liar, where I say to you, I am lying. And if I'm telling you the truth, then I'm not lying. And if I'm lying, then I'm telling you the truth. So things like this don't make sense to computation. You can't understand them. A machine, like sort of 1950s sci-fi style, if you give it a paradox, it like explodes, right? It doesn't understand how those things work. So this sort of brought me to begin thinking about what exists outside of computation, and uncomputability is a sort of interesting site to explore. So the project begins with this sort of early history and thinking about like what is outside, what is not visible. And from there, it sort of led me to a series of figures in the history of computing, queer figures in the history of computing that are very well known within computer science, but that no one discusses their sexuality or the relationships they had between one another. I just want to describe a few of them here, particularly this man, because I think he's especially interesting for people working in an art context. This is Christopher Strachey, who in many ways can be considered the first computer artist. Strachey grew up he's also a British computer scientist. He was a colleague and friend of Alan Turing in the 1950s. And he grew up in the Bloomsbury group, which is, the group of sort of artists and authors in Bloomsbury outside London that Virginia Woolf and other people were a part of. And importantly, in 1952, along with Alan Turing, he produced a program that's now been called the sort of love letter generator. And it's an algorithm that produced and printed these sort of algorithmically constructed love letters to some sort of unnamed other. They assigned MUC, which stands for Manchester University Computer. And sort of famously, he developed this program because he had some free time and he thought it was sort of fun and interesting. And then they would post them all over the sort of boards outside of the office, and like nobody knew what they were for a long time. It was not clear like what was going on. They didn't tell anybody about it. You can actually see the artist and scholar David Link, he's a German artist, has done a lot of really fantastic work with Strachey's early research and his archive, and this is a sort of recreation of that project. These are cathode ray tubes that are sort of processing the information from the Manchester Mark I, and that's a sort of proto-teletype machine printing out these poems that he then posts to the wall. He also made early computer sound and music, and he made a lot of really early games. He made like a checkers game in the early 1950s. And he was also a gay man who really struggled with his sexuality, and whose who died fairly early in the 1970s and whose sexuality is never really discussed in the biographies of him or any of these sorts of things. And his relationship with Turing, not a romantic relationship, but nonetheless sort of made invisible. Strachey's work then led to the work of Peter Landon, who is his assistant for a number of years. They both did a lot of work on programming languages that aren't necessarily super important. What's interesting to me about Landon is that in the 70s, when the Gay Liberation Front happened, he sort of abandoned computer science and became an activist. He sort of saw these as two different parts of his life. And then at his funeral in 2009, he just passed away very recently. It's sort of described by one of his colleagues as this bizarre scene where he showed up to the funeral and like on the one side were all these like radical queer people, and on the other side were all the computer scientists, and neither of them had any idea the other existed, basically, that he lived these two completely separate lives, which is a huge part of this project too. You know, why is it that we think about the personal and sexual lives of artists and writers, we don't think about the personal lives of scientists, mathematicians, and technical people? One of the final people in the history is Andrew Hodges, who's Turing's biographer. And Hodges is a mathematician himself, who in the 1970s was really a huge part of the early Gay Liberation Front, and wrote a book called With Downcast Gaze that's about sort of shame in the sort of history of or in like GLBT history and like the politics of outing and things like that. And one of his co-authors in this piece was actually a former lover of Alan Turing. And when he found out about that as a mathematician, he had no idea that that Alan Turing was a gay man. It was largely sort of written out of his history. Turing's papers and diaries were burned after his death by his family, and there's almost no archival material related to Turing's life. So when he found out about this, he thought it was really important to sort of tell this history, and there's a massive biography that he produced after that, sort of thinking through what the importance of visibility and archiving are for gay GLBT people in the history of technology. So all of this is sort of the first project in a way, and I'd love to talk about it more, and I know that we're sort of wrapping up, but this has sort of led to a series of other projects that I'm currently engaged in that I want to briefly mention. Most of all, it's led to a realization of the need for queer archives that deal with people in the history of sort of technology and mathematics, of which over the course of these several years, it turns out there are a ton of them, and that they're people whose sexuality is largely left out of their biographies, and who I think are interesting people not only to sort of bring to light, but also to put into kind of a theoretical practice. So that's sort of one of the things I'm working on now, and I'm particularly interested in when I published the series on Rhizome, I was amazed by how many people came to me and said, oh, what about this person? Or, oh, what about that person? People I had never heard of and whose Wikipedia entries don't say anything about their sexuality, but who it's kind of like weird, queer grapevine. People would tell me about their sort of sexual lives or the importance of their sexuality to their research. But I wanted also to really try and work at finding a queer history that wasn't just about cisgendered white men, as you can imagine. It's very important, and I mean, these people all knew each other. There's sort of a line or a thread that you can draw between them, which doesn't excuse, but certainly explains to a certain degree why they are the figures that are most visible in this history. But there are also a number of really incredible trans women in the history of technology that I've sort of begun to do research on as well. This is Lynn Conway. Lynn Conway is a sort of pioneer, a trans pioneer in a lot of ways. She transitioned in the early 1960s. She basically had a whole career at MIT, and then transitioned and had to start her career over because nobody could know that she was trans, and then started working at IBM. And then in the 1970s, is sort of like the critical figure in the sort of silicon chip revolution that happened. It's called Very Large Scale Integration, or VLSI. And then in the 90s, she finally came out as trans and has become a sort of vocal advocate for GLBT people in the sciences, which you can see the sort of STEM research group here. This is Sophie Wilson. Oh, sorry, I guess this is Sophie Wilson. Sorry for the text. So Sophie Wilson is also a trans woman, a British computer scientist who is sort of an early pioneer in computing. She designed the Acorn microcomputer, but she also designed the ARM processor, which it's not important that you know about it, but the fun anecdote, there are more arm processors in the world than there are human arms. They're in basically every technology. All of your phones have an ARM processor in them. All of your computers do. This does. It's a sort of piece of microelectronics. You can see her holding up an example of it right there. That's in basically every technology that we use every day. She also designed a lot of the technologies that make the modern internet work, and is, again, a trans woman. This is Danielle Bunton-Berry. Sorry again for the text, who's a game designer from the 1980s, who made this game Mule, which was very popular among Atari aficionados, and transitioned in the 1990s. She's a really fantastic figure, but also is an interesting figure because she then later came out and very publicly regretted her transition, which I think is interesting only in that I don't want this to be a project that's about, you know, celebration and visibility. I think that there's sort of a really challenging task here of basically making people visible, but not trying to recuperate them and pretending like people like Alan Turing, lived positive, sort of free, open lives. You know, it's an attempt to make visible difference, but also understand the challenges of that difference. This is a quote by Heather Love that I won't read because we're out of time, but it deals with these kinds of questions. You know, how do we think about the sort of tragedy of queer history while also making visible that history at the same time? There are a few other directions that I'm working on now. I'm doing a project now as well about what I'm calling queer programming languages. That are called esoteric programming languages. This is a programming language called Brainfuck, which is made to be completely unusable. They're all complete languages that you can technically program in, but they're often designed to be so confusing that they don't really work and nobody actually uses them, which I find to be a really interesting kind of queer critique. I'm also really interested in the relationship between failure and video games. And there's a huge art game scene that some of you may be aware of by queer people. This is a game called Dysphoria by Anna Anthropy, who's a San Francisco game designer. That's sort of an exploration of the process of transitioning that really engages with questions of like performance and failure. So this is the first level of the game, which if you kind of use your eye to follow the path, like it's impossible to get through the path, right? So how do we sort of make visible through technology the kind of embodied condition of failure that is the lives of many queer people? So I think this is a fantastic space for new and emerging work to be done, and I don't think it's just interesting, I think it's really crucial and necessary. The way that we understand and articulate our identities has undergone a radical change over the past 30 years, and we can no longer produce work that ignores the influence of computing and technology on our sense of identity and personhood. So I would encourage those of you who are interested in either art and technology or queer art practices to take a closer look at the tools that we use and how they shape the way that we think about and engage with the world. Thank you very much.